From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. As much as we love to, dig into new technologies, dig into new startups, sometimes it's always just good to talk to the people who are really insiders into what's going on in Silicon Valley, and people that are really starting to look at not only the technology, but the business models behind these technologies and figure out where trends are going, what's going to be viable, and maybe, dig into some things that maybe aren't available on the surface as easily as we might want to. So very excited to have an old friend of the show. Good to have him back on the show, Joseph Jacks, who I always like to call, one of my favorite Silicon Valley insiders. Joseph, JJ, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me again, Brian.
You do a lot of different things. We've known each other for a while. You do a lot of different things. Give folks real quick just a little bit of your background, maybe starting from kind of when we met back in the days when you were just digging in with Kubernetes and starting a company in that space and starting KubeCon and that sort of stuff. And then give folks a sense of what you're working on these days or the areas you're kind of exploring.
Sure, yeah. So first, it's great to be back on the show. I'm a huge fan of the Cloudcast. You guys have been doing an awesome job covering cloud computing as a trend and a massive movement over the last, how many years has it been? Is it like almost 10 years you've been running the show?
Yeah, 7 or 8 years. So yeah, it's been quite a while.
Wow, that's amazing. So honored to be back on. I've been pretty heavily involved in the Kubernetes project since actually a little bit before it came out. I got really excited about it, and then I was at Mesosphere. Started the first company around Kubernetes called Kismatic, which was late 2014, a little bit after the project was released. And through that, got to help a bunch of companies and sort of participate in some of the community and ecosystem developments around Kubernetes early on. I started the conference around Kubernetes, KubeCon, which was sort of a stroke of luck, I guess. And there was a conference for Go and Mesos and Cloud Foundry, and it was sort of like, there should be a conference for this really cool project called Kubernetes. That ended up getting donated to the Linux Foundation's CNCF when the CNCF was formed, shortly after it was formed. And I've been sort of involved in that. Kismatic was acquired by a company called Prenda, one of the very early first .NET-based platform as a service vendors. Interesting history there. After staying at Prenda for a little over a year, working on product and technology-related things, I joined a Quantum Corporation, which is a storage company up in Seattle, and I was an entrepreneur in residence there, helping with a project called Rook. Rook, like the chess piece. Yep. It's a storage orchestration sort of layer for distributed file system, block object file storage, and databases, message queues, different storage services on Kubernetes. Takes advantage of a lot of the Kubernetes extensibility primitives for sort of deeply integrating stateful workloads on Kubernetes and orchestrating the lifecycle of those services. There was a company spun up around Rook and also focused on multi-cloud Kubernetes late last year. That I helped with. And then so I've been advising a few companies as well. I'm working on my own startup, and we're coming out of stealth pretty soon. And I do a few other things, but I'm pretty excited about the Kubernetes project naturally. And then recently, I've been writing a lot about a topic I'm super passionate about, which is this kind of idea of commercial open source software. I think something that doesn't really get enough attention in the industry, and so I'm trying my best to write a blog post every week. I've missed the last couple of weeks, which is not a great start because I've only been writing for about a month and a half, but I'm dropping 3 new posts this week to catch up and pay my dues for being a slacker. But that's basically my the last few years of my life in a nutshell. Yeah, no, it's good. Normally, we would typically have you on because, like you said, you're working on a startup. It's going to come out. There's going to be some cool new technologies, but putting that to the side because, like you said, still in stealth, got a little ways to go to get it out the door. We thought we would talk to you a little bit about all this kind of research, not just opinion things you're doing, but really kind of research and a bunch of things around trying to understand what
open source means in a commercial software sense, and what it means in terms of revenue, what it means in terms of trends. And before you kind of got on this latest thing about writing about it, you've been tracking it, and I know a number of people have been kind of following this Google spreadsheet you have, but you've kind of now given it a name. You're calling it the Commercial Open Source Software Company Information, or COSSCI Index. So talk about, we'll put a link in the show notes, people can go take a look at it. Really, it's a whole bunch of companies that open source is at their core, but they're commercial companies in various stages, from IPO to been in the market a while. But how did you go about collecting all this information? A lot of it's not necessarily public. Talk about kind of how you put all this stuff together.
Yeah, so I mean, the origin story behind the COSSCI Index, as I call it, because it's too many words saying Commercial Open Source Software Company Index, so I just came up with a cute little nickname for it. Was actually about 4 years ago, I started managing a little spreadsheet privately. Maybe there were like 5 or 6 companies on it at the time. And I was sort of like, are there really more than like 1 or 2 companies that have built significant businesses around open source software? It's sort of beyond Red Hat and Cloudera, maybe. And I realized that there actually were at the time more than just a couple, and there were like a good handful, five or six, might have even been 10 at that point. So I sort of put together like a spreadsheet of 5 or 6 different data points. When was the company founded? How much venture capital had the company raised? How many employees? What was the space they were in? Sort of stuff like this. Very rudimentary kind of structured way of looking at this. And about a year later, I got into this Twitter thread with Derek Collison, who's the founder of Cloud Foundry, and he's been a huge open source contributor and entrepreneur, as well as Luke Kanies, who is the creator and founder of Puppet Labs, which is a big open source company as well. And it was kind of like along the lines and the topic of, is it possible to basically monetize open source at scale? Like, are there a bunch of companies doing this? Do the models work? And also, the sort of existential question of, how do you capture value with open source software? Because it just creates so much value. And so I sort of jumped into that thread. I've happened to, be fortunate enough to know Derek and Luke for a little bit. And I was like, well, there's actually quite a few companies. I've got a little spreadsheet I've been managing, because there was a sort of like, pessimism, or shall we say skepticism of, there can't really be that many companies that have like figured this out, like maybe 10 or so.
Right. And it's the eternal question of like, will there ever be another Red Hat, and are they a unicorn, or is there a way to build another business model that could grow to that size, or something like that? Precisely.
And so I jumped into the thread, and I was like, well, hey guys, I've got this spreadsheet. I'll just open source it. And so I did that. I wrote a blog post, I think a week or two later. And I think at that point, the sheet had maybe 15 or so companies. I want to say probably a little bit less. And it was about 30 or 40 billion dollars worth of valuation there, not including Red Hat. So I decided to leave Red Hat out initially. I've added Red Hat since, because the index is over $100 billion now. Criteria for the sheet, which is kind of the main anchor point to understand, is you can't be listed on the sheet unless you're generating or are on sort of like a revenue run rate of $100 million or more. And the reason I picked $100 million, this is like the level of revenue, at least a few years ago, that a software company would need to reach in order to sort of have a high likelihood of going public with a degree of predictability around the revenue and a few other things. And that sort of informed the design of the sheet. And yeah, that's kind of the origin story. And since then, I've been managing and updating the sheet every month. I go and update the values. I add more companies. And I have a bunch of different data sources for sort of how the sheet's managed, like from Crunchbase, LinkedIn data. I Google around. I talk to different VCs. Obviously, I talk to the founders of these companies. And it's kind of an interesting space. And I've developed lots of opinions about the sheet. lots of different observations that you can draw from it. That's the sort of origin behind writing this blog series called Open Consensus.
Yeah, and like I said, we will put the spreadsheet out in the show notes for folks. They can go take a look at it. If you're happen to be listening to this and you're super interested right away, you can actually get to it if you go to OSS.cache. So like open source software.cache is the tiny URL that will redirect to it. So definitely a lot of really interesting data in there and stuff that, like you said, you kind of have to have a little bit of insight to sort of estimate what some of these numbers mean. And like you said, you've done some things in terms of being able to just look at how many people they've hired, how long they've been in business and so forth. That gives you good heuristics on where those things are going. Yep. Let's talk a little bit about, beyond this index that you've been keeping. You've been up until, like you said, the last week or so, you've been sort of writing very vociferously about a bunch of different aspects of, what is commercialization of open source software, open source projects look like. And one of the things that is one of the core articles you wrote about was this idea of, what is open core? And I think if you've been around the industry for a while, there was kind of a belief that there's sort of one definition of open core. It's sort of, you've got some open source and then you add some proprietary stuff and that becomes your business. And you really dig into it now that, like you said, we've had a lot of companies doing this. You really dig into it and you look at this from the perspective of almost like, how thick is the core of that open core? Is it thin? Is it heavy? And you go into a lot of details about different examples of companies that are, at different stages or different parts of that spectrum. Talk a little bit about how you're thinking about open core or how it helps you kind of model what the industry looks like.
Yeah, so this is a really big topic, and it's the second post that I wrote about on the Open Consensus blog. The first one was just introducing the index, which again, for reference, if all of this is sounding too abstract for your listeners, it's sort of like an S&P 500 index, but for open source businesses, like commercial open source companies that are like the larger, more successful sort of quote unquote blue chip ones. Interestingly, like from that index, from that spreadsheet, one of the really huge observations that I sort of spelled out in the business model column was that this idea of open core, like as a business model, because open source is not a business model, but there's different ways to commercialize open source. Support services, training, open core is another business model. And so what open core looks like is, in the context of that sheet, is kind of the main business model, the main way that the majority of these companies actually commercialize a given open source project, or in some cases, multiple open source projects inside of one company. And so I decided that the second post should actually reflect the importance of that observation and sort of break it down, because the other realization was that that I sort of saw, I guess, and I have seen in the industry for a while, that very few people kind of understand what open core means. Like, as you mentioned, Brian, is sort of like a lot of people go and sort of look at it from a black and white kind of lens, and it's like, you've got some proprietary thing around the open source, and it's kind of like, fake open source, or you're pure open source. Right. And I think it's more nuanced than that. Like most things in life, there's like this gray spectrum, right? And so in that second post, what I basically did was like, okay, let's just let's kind of lay down a definition. What does it really mean? And then give some examples, and what are the trade-offs between the spectrum of sort of implementation options. And so basically, I like lay out the few. I mean, there's probably like 15 or 20, perhaps even more, like ways you can implement open core, like as a business model for an open source based company or company based around an open source project or projects. But I sort of broke down 4 ways of implementing open core, from sort of a thin or a skinny end of one spectrum all the way to a thicker, really sort of dense end of the other end of the spectrum. And what it basically means is, like, for a thin or a skinny crust and a really thick core, what that would mean is like the core is the open source piece, like sort of the nut or the center of that circle is where all the open source code lives. All the sort of free to use, free to distribute, and extend upon, and so on, open source software. But the crust, the sort of layer around that sort of center, is where you sort of extend additional features or packaging or say forks, extensions. There's a bunch of different ways you can go and add proprietary intellectual property or sort of product level things around that open source core. Yep. And on the other end of the spectrum, you can sort of get a smaller and smaller core and a thicker and thicker crust.
Right.
And so like the crust is like on the other end of the spectrum, say 90% closed source. But if the core, the 10% of the core is just a tiny little core, is open source, it still constitutes as an open core business model. And that's the sort of fundamental way of, I think, like the fundamental way of looking at it. And I really like challenged myself to find examples in each of these, each of these implementation models. And they're not perfect. I mean, they're probably going to change over time potentially, and they're sort of like prone to error and so on. But like, you could say GitHub or MuleSoft are sort of the thick open core model where there's like a thick crust. And on the skinny side of the spectrum, the opposite end, you might say HashiCorp or Databricks are on the sort of like there's a very thin crust, or skinny crust, and mostly very, very significant open source base, because predominantly those companies are just adding minimal extensions or additional features or IP kind of around the open source bits.
Yeah, and I think the thing I would encourage people to do is, I know there's people out there who want to make the argument, how open source are you? Are you 100% open source? And I think the thing to me that was really interesting, and this is right, there isn't kind of one answer in there. Part of it was, look, there's lots of people that have been successful or are growing success across the spectrum. But I think the other thing for people to kind of think about, especially if their initial thought is, well, I can think of an open core company that failed and therefore, they're all going to fail, is think about a couple of different things, right? We deliver software in multiple ways now. It can still be packaged. It can it can come from the cloud as like an IaaS type of service. It can be a SaaS type of service. So there's that. There's are you selling things? Are you involved with things where one company is kind of the dictator of the open source project? Are lots of projects and lots of others involved? So there's kind of like, how does the open source community work, and how does that impact the company who commercializes it, or a bunch of them? And so there's a whole bunch of variables that I think are interesting for people to kind of consider, because what it'll help them do is it may very well help them differentiate between a thinness or a thickness of core, but it may also give them some sense of like, oh, okay, that variable will have a stronger influence on something than this other variable, and I need to kind of compare and contrast them. So, I like it as a framework. It's not overly complicated. It provides enough examples that you're like, okay, those are names I've heard of, but it also then sort of forces you to go like, okay, if something new comes along, not only what category does it fit in, but like, what are the variables or the things that will influence it being in one or the other? And, do those offer it a better chance for success or more likelihood of failure? So cool. And again, a lot of the things we're talking about today, we could probably go on entire shows about. I'm kind of highlighting some things because I want folks to go read the stuff. I want them to go read the blogs. And I think there's a lot of good thought-provoking things in there. I want to switch topics a little bit. To a certain extent, you've lived on the side of innovator, startup and so forth. You've also, like you said, been entrepreneur in residence. You sort of, are amongst VCs. Open source, there are lots of projects. Lots of them have gotten different velocities, but to a certain extent nowadays, we see projects that gain a lot of velocity because there was some VC funding behind maybe the original company. Maybe there was VC funding behind the sort of second round of companies that got behind that. Ultimately, as a VC, you're looking to try and help companies that capture a lot of the value in a market. You mentioned before, like open source creates a ton of value, but then the question is who captures it. Do you see any concern from venture capitalists who are saying, I don't know that I'm seeing enough exits. Maybe I'm seeing some acquisitions, but maybe there's not enough exits. I mean, do you feel like there's still just general momentum, general good feelings from the venture capital community about continuing to invest in companies if they say their initial product is open source, or do you feel like maybe they're starting to get a little more sophisticated about, what does that mean that open source is part of what you do versus how you're going to monetize it?
A lot of questions in there. I'll try and parse some of them out. I think I understand your top level one, which is, how does the venture capital industry sort of look at open source in terms of evaluating the opportunity and how they sort of approach the overall like funding equation,
right?
And how do companies actually form? Like you mentioned, how does the value actually get captured? I actually want to make a few comments on that first. So this is a really, really huge, dense topic, but I think it comes down to one of the fundamental truths about open source software in the context of like business building, which is a given open source project that has a high propensity for commercialization will always generate orders and orders of magnitude more value than anyone can capture. Right, and that is fundamentally different from proprietary software, from closed source software of the last, many decades. And open source is 20 years old now, but it's really had a huge upswing and inflection over the last 10 years, 5 to 10 years. So one of the really interesting things, though, as a kind of a reference point for companies that have actually started to see outcomes, because I think you've asked about this as well in your multi-part question there, was like where are the exits? Are there companies that have actually shown and proven that venture capital can sort of work in this category, if you want to call it a category,
right?
Which I think is a really interesting way of looking at it. I think in this year alone, we've actually seen quite a few of these outcomes. It's kind of interesting. So in this spreadsheet, this index, this COSSCI Index, if you look at column I, so A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I like interesting. And you go to the bottom, cell 37 right now, but it's probably going to change when there are more companies added, which there will be. As of right now, there's $36.39 billion in outcomes. Which is like when an IPO happens or a private equity event or merger or acquisition, right?
Right.
Interestingly, in the last 6 months alone, about 20 billion, a little more than 20 billion of that has happened. So like the vast majority of that 36 billion, 20 billion of it is only 6 months old. And I can actually enumerate the examples. So in January of this year, CoreOS was acquired by Red Hat for $250 million. February, Alfresco was taken private by Thomas H. Lee, private equity firm, for $300 million. In March, but you'll notice a trend here. It's almost on a monthly basis. In March, Salesforce acquired MuleSoft for $6.5 billion. In April, Pivotal IPO'd at $4 billion. Now they're trading at $6 billion. In May, Adobe acquired Magento for $1.68 billion. In June, Microsoft acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. In July, a couple of weeks ago, ARM acquired Treasure Data for $600 million. And we're in August now. We're in the middle of August. And so if history is any indication of the future, which I think it is in a few cases, might not be here, but if it is, we'll likely see another open source outcome potentially this month and then the months following. And so I think to answer your question, like venture as an industry has actually been pretty handsomely rewarded investing in this category, but I think it's really just been done, frankly, from the wrong sort of lens, because a lot of these companies, in some cases, I believe in many cases, were potentially overfunded, where they took in a little bit more capital than they needed to, because open source is actually very, very efficient in terms of a distribution model and the way you actually go and acquire customers.
Right.
Get to product market, like a bunch of different things that really should reduce the cost of getting to scale and significant revenue in terms of like the venture investments like required. But I do think it's an interesting area of investment, and the venture capital industry has definitely seen nice returns. You can see in column C, ABC, 7.2 billion has been poured into this commercial open source company index list of companies, and the outcomes are,
36 billion so far, and majority of the companies are still private. So I mean, it's probably 10x, 15x returns overall once all those companies go public or get acquired. I'd say within the next 2 to 3 years, the ones on this sheet are all likely going to see outcomes. Probably percent of them most likely, just based on the sort of track record of the last 12 months or so. Right.
Yeah, and I think the interesting, as you dig into this, like you said, you think about those different acquisitions. They range in. There's variability in there, and I think that's an interesting aspect. You've got, like you said, things like CoreOS, which is very much a technology and engineering acquisition. You've got things like MuleSoft, which could be its own standalone product. It could blend into Salesforce. You've got GitHub, which is entirely a SaaS offering, and I think what you're sort of showing there, and if people dig into it, is there isn't necessarily one way anymore that you'll see an acquisition either happen, the reason for how it happens, or how it eventually kind of matures into the thing that gets used by, let's say, the acquirer, or in the case of Pivotal, becomes an IPO and survives out in the public market as a standalone company. So lots of different outcomes, which I think it's interesting. Folks, we're not a prediction show. Past performance does not necessarily guarantee anything in the future, but it does give you some sense of what are the different, how this is evolving over time. Well, let's do this. Let me ask you one sort of last question, because we're getting near the end here. Putting your prediction hat on, looking at your crystal balls. There are some things that are sort of obvious in your models. I think like you said, you're beginning to see some trends. What do you think are some of the kind of truths, if you will, that you've now uncovered? Things that you're like, that you can't doubt these types of things based on what you've seen over the last 4 years as it applies to open source commercialization, open source companies.
That's a huge question, and as much as I love playing Nostradamus, I'll try and be maybe a little bit more conservative in like things. I think that commercial open source is a really, really, really big deal. I mean, I think it's kind of totally misunderstood, underappreciated, and the fundamentals are quite quite unique. So I think in the next sort of several years, one thing that will remain is, and that we've already sort of seen a lot of, open source is just going to continue to grow as a huge, huge movement. And we've seen the largest software company in the world, which is Microsoft, at the CEO level, Satya Nadella, board level, on down, make the biggest embrace in the history of the software industry of open source ever, with embracing Linux, with embracing open source developer ecosystems, with embracing Kubernetes, with acquiring GitHub. Bunch of things that really, in my mind, are just glaringly obvious signs that open source is the future of software. It's really, and so I don't mean to bring up the extremely polarizing cryptocurrency blockchain ecosystem, but the reality is that entire ecosystem is based on open source software. The Bitcoin paper came out, someone implemented it, probably this him, he, they, it, Satoshi Nakamoto entity implemented Bitcoin, I believe in C initially, and released the code publicly, and lots of collaboration happened, and it was an open source movement, continues to be transparently governed and run in the public like an open source project. Ethereum is the same way, and so these are open source ecosystems actually defining, changing, disrupting huge industries: financial services, cloud computing, enterprise software, infrastructure software, machine learning and artificial intelligence, kind of like all the big, huge technology categories of the next decade or two will be based on open source software as a lever for bringing new innovation to huge, huge numbers of people on Earth, which is kind of an amazing thing to see. I think even adjacent to that, one of the things that a really good friend of mine and someone super smart told me the other day, actually I'll mention who he is, because I think it's a really profound comment. Marco Palladino, the founder and CTO of Kong, the API gateway platform. Well, he said that open source software, you can't really relegate it just to software. Open source is something that will permeate everything. And I think one of the really great reference points of that is, when Tesla actually open sourced the patents for their for their manufacturing operations and design and all the technology that goes into building the Tesla models. Elon didn't think twice about saying, hey, our value differentiation is not in owning these patents, but it's really in bringing this innovation to market at scale and executing. And I think that is really, really profound. And over time, open source software is going to mean a lot more than just open sourcing software. It'll mean standard way of, it'll equate to the standard way of building products and technology for the future. I think two other things about the future in open source, which are very obvious to me, and I'm writing about two posts this week about this, and hopefully another one. I'm able to get these out. I think open source software completely eats cloud computing, and I think it also eats software as a service. And what I mean by that is, cloud computing is this basically locked in proprietary ecosystem right now. Google Cloud is embracing open source, but I think there's still a lot of vendor lock-in dynamics there. I think open source completely disaggregates proprietary platform services. And then as for SaaS, or software as a service, a little hint to this is if you look at a SaaS index equivalent of my open source index, it's actually run by a VC firm called Bessemer Venture Partners. It's called the BVP Cloud Index. And they actually benchmark the top public software as a service companies like Salesforce and Workday and many others. I believe over time, over 15 years probably, it'll take a little bit longer, open source software eats all of those platforms as well. What I mean by eats is it sort of reimagines what those platforms and products will look like with fundamentals based on open source projects and sort of new designs kind of from the ground up. Distribution model, go to market models kind of change. And so I think it's ultimately about open source software eating the world as opposed to software eating the world.
Interesting. Well, we will also get the Bessemer Ventures Index in there as well for folks who want to kind of compare those things. Listen, with that, we're gonna kind of wrap this up. If folks want to reach out to you or kind of pick your brain on stuff, or talk to you on Twitter or wherever, what's a good way for them to reach out or connect?
Oh, I'm really active on Twitter. I love Twitter. I've met some of the smartest and most cool, awesome people through Twitter. I think I met you through Twitter as well, Brian. So it's just been an invaluable resource for me. I'm async.io on Twitter, ASYNCHIO. It's short for asynchronous IO, not the Python library. A lot of people mistake me for writing that library. I did not write it. You just DM me. My DMs are open, or shoot me a tweet.
All right, very good. Folks, with that, we're going to wrap it up. Definitely go take a look at JJ's blog, Open Consensus. Data-driven perspective on open source software. We have the link in the show notes for you. He's got a bunch of stuff that's, like he said, going to be coming out here. So after you get through those first 5-6 blog posts, your head's exploding, he'll have more for you very soon. So JJ, with that, thank you as always for being on. Great to talk to you. And folks, with that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.